Hello, this is the 2.14 lesson, the second part of the video, and we were in the midst of the reading, starting here with on page 656, From Country to City. Like many phenomena of the 1920s, youth culture was partly a product of an increasingly urban America. The 1920 census found that for the first time, more than half of Americans lived in urban areas rather than in villages or on farms, with urban defined at the time as a place with more than 2,500 inhabitants. Americans flocked to the cities for many different reasons. Some followed economic opportunity, others wanted to escape the rigid customs of small town life. Young women in particular sought freedom in the cities where they could earn wages, live on their own, and break free of constricting social rules. Many residents of rural and small town America began to associate cities with corruption and moral decay. In turn, many urban intellectuals and writers mocked rural and small town America as backward and stifling. The acid-tongued Baltimore journalist H.L. Mencken scorned what he saw as Middle America's prudish Puritanism, which he defined as the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. Sinclair Lewis, in novels such as Main Street and Babbitt, portrayed middle-class, small-town America life as mean, shallow, and hypocritical. School as social cosmos. As the population shifted from country to cities, children whose work was no longer required on the family farm stayed in school longer. High school graduation rates and college attendance soared. When Robert and Helen Lynn visited Muncie, Indiana in the 1920s, they found that the high school, with its athletics, clubs, sororities, and fraternities, dances and parties, and other extracurricular activities, is a fairly complete social cosmos in itself, and about this city within a city, the social life of the intermediate generation centers. Because it was quite common, most people went to school up till the 8th grade. And then after that, it was time for them to work. But as, like I said, as it shifted, high school graduation became increasingly popular. The Jazz Age. Let's look at the picture first. Americans flocked to cities for different reasons, not the least of which were economic opportunity and personal freedom. The Jazz Age. For the post-war young generation, the music of choice was jazz, the vibrant new American music that got a start in the cultural melting pot of New Orleans. There, African American musicians mixed African rhythms with European musical traditions, the jaunty swing of ragtime and more. As these musicians migrated north to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and other cities, they took jazz with them. Jazz musicians often improvised on popular melodies, infusing the music with freshness and spontaneity of unfettered personal expression. Jazz was so popular that the Roaring Twenties in America are also known as the Jazz Age. Young people danced to jazz in nightclubs and listened to it on the radio and on phonograph records. As the popularity of jazz grew, so did outcries against the new music. One professor described jazz as an irritation of the nerves of hearing, a sensual teasing of the strings of physical passion. A New York newspaper warned that because of jazz, moral disaster is coming to hundreds of young American girls. That didn't stop people from lining up to get into the Cotton Club in Harlem, a largely African American section of New York City. There in the late 1920s, crowds danced to the jazz music of Duke Ellington's band. In the segregated club, the crowds were white and musicians were black. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. The writer F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda embodied America's frantic jazz age youth culture. As a young writer from the Midwest, Fitzgerald found himself swept up in a wave of fame and fortune with the runaway success of his first novel, This Side of Paradise. He became known as the nation's expert on flappers. Fitzgerald earned most of his income by writing short stories he sold to mass market magazines such as the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's. He aspired to write more serious literature, and he succeeded. His 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby, is regarded as a classic work of American fiction. Young, attractive, and outgoing, Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, here's a picture of him down below, exemplify both the good and the bad aspects of the decade's live-for-the-moment attitude. They spent money far beyond their means, flitting from one party to the next, living in New York and Paris, and frequently engaging in public spectacles. Newspapers loved reporting how Scott would arrive at a party on the hood of a car, clutching a champagne bottle, or how the couple got evicted from New York's Biltmore Hotel because of their raucous behavior. They didn't make the 20s, the silent film star Lillian Gish remarked. They were the 20s. The Lost Generation. For some time, the glittering festivities of the Roaring Twenties For some, the glittering festivities of the Roaring Twenties had a desperate edge, like an attempt to drown the sorrows of the past decade in a binge of frantic partying. Many of the young American soldiers who had gone off to fight in the Great War returned home bitter and disillusioned. They had lived through poison gas, muddy trenches, and the death of friends. They had longed for the safe familiarity of home, but once back, they felt like strangers in a strange land. They asked themselves, did their sacrifice have any meaning? What was the point of it? What is the point of anything? Such questions haunted a young American writer named Ernest Hemingway. He had served as a Red Cross ambulance driver in the war. Only a few weeks after arriving in Europe, Hemingway was seriously wounded by a mortar shell that killed one soldier and blew the legs off another. After the war, Hemingway returned to America. Like others back from the war, he felt uncomfortable and out of place. The war had changed him, but home remained relatively unchanged. Hemingway, an aspiring writer, took a job with a newspaper that sent him to Paris as a correspondent. There he joined a growing group of expatriate artists and writers. With his new bride, Hemingway settled into a cheap apartment on the part of Paris called the Left Bank. He filed reports for his newspaper and worked on writing his first stories. He strived to write a plain, clear, unadorned style. He often visited Gertrude Stein, an American writer whose home in Paris served as a hub for artists and writers. It was Stein who once said to a young visitor, "All of you young people who served in the war, you are all a lost generation." Hemingway pretended to dislike the label, but he and other writers of his generation, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, John Dos Passos, and Hart Crane, understood what she meant. They had been changed by the war. The values they had grown up with seemed empty in the post-war world. In an epigraph to his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, published in 1926, Hemingway quoted Stein's words. In doing so, he fixed a name to the generation that had survived the war only to confront the disorienting uncertainties that followed, the lost generation. Modernism in art and literature. In the decade before World War I, although the Western world was mostly at peace, the new technologies seemed to promise progress and prosperity. Many writers and artists in both the United States and Europe looked uneasily toward the future. The air was full of new, fascinating, and sometimes unsettling ideas. The pioneering Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud theorized that humans are not rational beings, but are driven by powerful, unconscious motives and instincts they cannot always understand or control. The German physicist Albert Einstein proposed his theory of relativity, which undermined the long-held notions of an orderly universe proceeding according to fixed laws of nature. Artists responded to these and other new ideas by questioning old uncertainties. In the movement known as modernism, many artists and writers rejected traditional values and existing rules and instead experimented with new forms and techniques. As early as 1913, Americans were introduced to modernist works, mostly by European artists, at the Armory Show in New York City, officially their international exhibition of modern art. Visitors to the show encountered the shock of the new Cubist paintings like the Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, which shattered the human form into a jarring array of planes and fragments. Such works provoked former President Theodore Roosevelt to sputter that these new paintings were no better than the crude images etched on cave walls in prehistoric times. The show traveled to other American cities and continued to elicit shock and ridicule from many visitors and critics. After World War I, modernist experimentation took on new urgency. For many who came of age in the 1920s, the brutality of war shattered any faith in the institution of society and government, or any confidence in human rationality and progress. In response to a world in which the old uncertainties seemed lost or fragmented, artists and writers explored creative paths that led in new directions, sometimes startling, sometimes disturbing. In literature, Sherwood Anderson examined a small town in rural America in Winesburg, Ohio, where he found a collection of characters compelled by frustrated desires and unconscious longings. Some American writers, particularly those in what Gertrude Stein dubbed the Lost Generation, fled to Europe. The poet Ezra Pound, for example, went to London, while Ernest Hemingway went to Paris. In the United States, the poets William Carlos Williams and Marianne Moore rejected old conventions and experimented with new forms of verse. In the South, William Faulkner undertook bold experiments in narrative. The sound and the fury, he extended the stream of consciousness technique, following the internal flow of character's mind, while while, as I lay dying, he created 15 different narrators, each of whom offered a different perspective on the same event. Let's look at the picture here. In I Saw the Figure Five in Gold, the American painter Charles Demuth was inspired by a poem by William Carlos Williams, in which the poet describes a fleeting image of a fire engine rushing by on a New York street. In the visual arts, American modernists explored reality from new perspectives. In photography, Alfred Stieglitz shot from unconventional angles produced striking photographs of ordinary objects and scenes, but with new aspects of tonality and design. Another photographer, Man Ray, experimented with surreal effects. Painters like Arthur Dove, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Charles Demuth experimented with abstraction. They did not try to imitate nature, but instead used line, shape, and color in new and imaginative ways. An age of reaction. After spending the better part of 2 years observing customs in the Midwestern city of Muncie, Indiana, Robert and Helen Lind wrote, "A citizen has one foot on the relatively solid ground of established institutional habits and the other fast to an escalator erratically moving in several directions at a bewildering variety of speeds." Indeed, it seemed that everything in the United States had been transformed in recent decades. Work, leisure, technology, the economy, communications, and the mass media had evolved in ways that left many Americans disoriented, bewildered, and wary. As media like radio and magazines spread urban customs, opinions, and music far and wide, many people outside the cities felt their traditional values threatened. They associated cities with immorality, corruption, godlessness, and un American ways. Never in recent generations, one journalist observed, have human beings so floundered about outside the ropes of social and religious sanctions. Reeling amid all this change, many Americans in the 1920s struck back. A resurgence of nativism. Alarmed by the upheavals of the modern era, many Americans blamed immigrants for bringing poverty and immorality to American shores. These nativists believed in the superiority of native-born Americans, in particular native-born white Protestants. Nativists pointed to the urban ghettos, home to many immigrants, as the breeding ground of disorder. After World War I and the Communist Revolution in Russia, Americans began to associate foreigners and immigrants with a menacing new strain of radicalism. A rash of labor strikes convinced many Americans that the country was falling prey to foreign anarchists. Let's read this part here, setbacks for labor. During World War I, temporarily high wages and a sense of shared patriotic purpose helped workers and employers get along. After the war, as prices rose, workers again found it hard to make ends meet. In 1919 alone, there were more than 2,500 strikes. But public opinion went against the workers. Roused by the Red Scare, many Americans saw the striking workers as dangerous radicals. The largest strike, called the Great Steel Strike, was staged by Midwestern steelworkers in September 1919. Company owners waged a public publicity campaign to brand the strikers, many of whom were recent immigrants, as Reds and un-American radicals. Government troops put down the strike in many cities, and the strike ended in a failure for the workers. Also in September 1919, when the police commissioner of Boston refused the demands of police officers to be allowed to form a union, the officers went on strike. Without police on duty, armed gangs took to looting and vandalizing in parts of the city. Outraged citizens opposed the strike and agreed with Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, who asserted, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." The strike collapsed and almost the entire Boston police force was fired to be replaced by new workers. For the next decade, the American labor movement continued to decline in membership and public support. In 1919, after a series of bombings in American cities, anxiety bloomed in full-blown hysteria. During the Red Scare, more than 10,000 aliens were arrested by federal, state, and local authorities. Many were found to have no connection to radical activity. Of the thousands arrested, only a few hundred were deported. Between June 1920 and 21, about some 800,000 foreigners entered the country. Nativists grew alarmed. 65% of the new immigrants hailed from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the great majority were Catholic or Jewish. One writer fretted, "The Protestant has been practically ousted from political life," and went on to warn that the city is Catholic governed and school as well as municipal departments reflect the influence of the Church of Rome. In the Dearborn Independent, Henry Ford claimed that Jews were part of an international conspiracy to control the world economy. An article in the Saturday Evening Post described Polish Jews as human parasites. In the wake of these nativist attacks, some ethnic groups began to form self-defense groups. Influential Jewish immigrants founded the American Defamation League, which set out to correct public misperceptions about Jews. And we'll stop this lesson here and start with the next one.